The sound came first. Not an alarm, not a voice, just the flat, dull percussion of a human body pressed against cold steel, the kind of sound a room full of people feels in the chest before the mind can name it. Then silence, the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. On the eastern edge of the Quantico corridor, set behind a featureless access road and 3 layers of unmarked security gates, there is a building that does not exist on any public map. No designation at the fence line, no sign at the entrance. The locals call it the Gray Box, though most of them have never seen it and would not want to. The men and women who work inside it call it Cerberus. The official designation, known only to those with the clearance to speak it aloud, is NC, TF-1 Naval Cyber Training Facility, First Installation. It does not look like power. That is by design. From the outside, it is a long, low structure of poured concrete and reinforced glass, the kind of building that architecture forgot. Inside it is something else entirely. Deep beneath the unremarkable exterior, past the biometric checkpoints, in the man-trap corridors, in the reinforced steel doors that weigh more than some armored vehicles, there is a room the size of a football field. The ceiling is 30 feet high. The walls are lined floor to ceiling, with server racks, thousands of them, humming at a constant low frequency, a sound like a breath held and never released. The air is cold enough to see. Blue light bleeds from every surface. And at the center of it all, suspended above the floor on a raised command platform, sits the most sophisticated naval warfare simulation architecture ever built. From this room, the United States Navy rehearses the end of the world. Every combat scenario, every cyber attack vector, every electronic countermeasure deployed by every potential adversary. The Pacific Fleet runs its digital war games through Cerberus. Strike group commanders practice blind navigation through jammed communications. Electronic warfare specialists train against simulated attacks built from actual foreign intelligence intercepts. When a crisis erupts somewhere on the ocean and an admiral needs to know how his systems will respond, the answer has already been tested here in this room, in this cold blue light. If Cerberus fails, the fleet does not simply lose a simulation. The fleet loses its vision, its ability to anticipate, its confidence in its own weapons in the moment before something else removes them entirely. This is what makes the room significant. This is what makes what happened inside it on an ordinary Thursday morning in November a story that would be told in hushed voices for the next decade. It began as so many important things do with someone being dismissed. Captain Garrett Holloway had commanded NCTF-1 Cerberus for 14 months, and in that time he had made the facility his. Not in the way a custodian makes a building his own, quietly, with care, learning every corner and every flaw. In the way a landlord does, loudly, visibly, with a specific attention to ensuring that everyone in the room understood who held the lease. He was not a stupid man. That is important to understand. Stupid men rarely rise to the command of facilities like Cerberus. Holloway had earned his position through genuine accomplishment, years of tactical operations, a decorated tour in electronic warfare commendations that filled 2 pages of his service record. He understood naval systems. He understood strategy. He understood the language of command. What he did not understand, what he had spent the better part of a decade carefully teaching himself not to understand, was silence. When Holloway walked into Cerberus at 0700 on a Thursday morning, he did what he always did. He made himself known. His voice preceded him through the main corridor, carrying 2 conversations at once, addressing a lieutenant to his left, while issuing an instruction to an ensign on his right. His uniform was immaculate, 4 rows of ribbons, each placed with the precision of a man who spent time before a mirror, ensuring they conveyed exactly the message he intended. His boots rang against the elevated metal flooring of the command deck with the rhythm of a man who wanted to be heard arriving. The junior officers straightened when they heard him coming. The technicians adjusted their postures at their consoles. The room reorganized itself around the fact of his approach, which was exactly how he preferred it. He did not notice the woman in the olive drab flight suit standing near the primary command node until he had already crossed half the floor. She was unremarkable in the specific way that only very deliberate people can be unremarkable. No rank on her collar, no name tape above the chest pocket. The flight suit itself was old, not worn out, but seasoned, the fabric carrying the softnesses of something washed and used and washed again across many years. She held a tablet in both hands, angled slightly downward, her eyes moving across the screen with the focused calm of someone deep in their own private work. She was standing in his room. She had not announced herself. Nobody had introduced her. She simply existed there, near the most sensitive node in the facility, as though she had always been there and saw no reason to explain herself. Holloway stopped 3 feet away and looked at her. The room found reasons to watch. What nobody in that room knew, what only one person present had noticed, was that the woman had arrived before any of them. Ensign Cole Kepler was 24 years old, the youngest technician on the Cerberus command deck, and he had developed the habit of early arrival that comes from knowing you are still proving yourself. He had badged in at 0615 nearly an hour before the facility opened for operations with a thermos of black coffee and a problem in the base code architecture he had been turning over in his mind for 3 days. He was at his secondary console in the rear of the command deck when the door opened at 0622 and a woman in an olive drab flight suit walked in alone. She showed her credentials to the overnight security officer. Kepler did not see what was on them, only that the officer's expression changed when he read them, a brief tightening around the eyes that could have been surprise or could have been recognition. And then she walked directly to the primary command node without hesitation. She knew where it was. She did not consult a floor diagram. She did not look around to orient herself. She walked to the node the way a person walks to a specific drawer in their own kitchen, with the ease of someone for whom the space holds no mysteries. For 40 minutes she worked in silence. Kepler watched her from across the room, not because he was suspicious, but because something about the depth of her focus was arresting. She moved the tablet slowly across the surfaces of the primary node housing, methodically pausing at measured intervals. She would stop, study the screen, then move 6 inches to the left and stop again. She was mapping something, cataloging something. At 0703, when the morning crew began filing in, and the room filled with the sounds of a facility coming to life, she did not change her behavior. She did not look up. She did not introduce herself or acknowledge the people around her. She continued her slow, precise work, as invisible to the incoming crowd as furniture. Kepler looked at the tablet in her hands. Just once at the right angle, the screen caught the light. He was not close enough to read the text, but he could see the small indicator in the upper corner of the display, a pulsing amber dot, the universal symbol for active recording. She was not reading documents. She was collecting evidence. He said nothing. He turned back to his own console and sat very still and thought carefully about what that might mean. And while he was thinking, Holloway walked through the door. "Ma'am." Holloway's voice carried the register of a man who has used it as an instrument for so long that its authority has become automatic. Not chosen, not deployed, simply present like weather. "I don't know what low-level intelligence billet you wandered out of, but this is the Fleet Cybernetics command deck." She did not look up. The junior officers nearby did what junior officers always do in such moments. They found other things to look at. Screens, keypads, the middle distance, anywhere that was not the collision point between the commanding officer and the silent woman he was addressing. "This is a restricted facility, not a reading room." Still nothing. The tablet moved a fraction of an inch. Her finger traced something on the screen with the unhurried focus of a person who has already decided the noise around her is not relevant. Holloway took a step forward. This was the moment Kepler would remember it with precision, when Commodore Owen Strickland appeared in the aft doorway. Strickland was the base Commodore, a decade older than Holloway, carrying the stillness of a man who had survived enough close calls to stop being startled by almost anything. He had been watching the command deck feed on a monitor in his office for the past 40 minutes. He had watched the woman arrive. He had watched her work. He had watched the overnight officer examine her credentials and change his expression in a way that told Strickland everything he needed to know. He knew what was on those credentials. He had been informed 3 months ago in a brief and direct communication he was not to discuss with anyone under his command that an inspection of NCTF-1 Cerberus would take place at an unspecified date conducted by an unspecified inspector, and that his role was to ensure access and observe. He stepped through the aft doorway now quietly and positioned himself along the wall. Not intervening, watching. Because some instinct refined across 30 years of naval service told him that what was about to happen needed to happen, and that the outcome was not in doubt. Holloway closed the remaining distance. "Are you deaf?" The word landed in the room like something thrown. Kepler's hand stopped moving over his keyboard. Holloway's hand shot out. He gripped her arm, used his leverage and size to spin her around, and pressed her back against the server rack bulkhead. The sound was soft, padded shoulder against cold steel, the whole thing over in less than a second. But in the silence that followed, the sound seemed to expand to fill the room, to crowd out everything else. The woman's back was against the wall. She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray, the specific gray of water before a storm. Not dark, not light, the color of something suspended between states. They held no alarm, no indignation, no fear. They held the steady clarity of complete attention as though she were watching something unfold at a useful distance and was in no hurry to reach a conclusion. It was not the look of someone surprised. It was not the look of someone frightened. It was the look of someone who had just collected the data points she came for. Identify yourself, Holloway said. His voice had dropped below the threshold where others could easily hear it, intimate and threatening, in the way of someone who has decided that restraint at this point is a form of control. And tell me what you are doing on my command deck. She said nothing. Across the room, Kepler looked at the tablet still in her hand. The amber recording indicator pulsed in the corner. Still active. Still recording. Every word. Every second. To understand what Garrett Holloway had become, you have to understand what he had been. 17 years is a long time. Long enough to forget the person you used to be. Long enough sometimes to be grateful for the forgetting. In 2017, Holloway was a commander with a strong record and a habit of confidence that most people in his orbit interpreted as competence. They were not wrong to do so. He was competent, genuinely more than competent, in the arenas where his skills had been tested. Tactical operations, systems management, the art of keeping a complex naval operation running under pressure. Where he was less competent, where he was, though he would not have recognized the word applied to himself in curious, was in the assessment of other people. There was a young officer in his command that year. His name was Waverly, lieutenant junior grade, quiet, technically gifted in ways that Holloway recognized but did not particularly value because the kind of depth Waverly possessed operated at a level not immediately visible in the rooms where Holloway spent his time. Waverly's contributions were not the kind that showed up in briefings. They showed up in the baseline health of systems nobody noticed until they broke. When the time came for Holloway to submit his formal evaluation of Waverly's readiness for promotion, he did what he always did. He trusted his own read. He had spent 8 months watching Waverly move through the unit, and what he observed was a junior officer who was technically capable but insufficiently present, quiet in meetings, slow to assert himself, not the kind of man who commanded a room. He wrote the evaluation in 40 minutes. He filed it without a second read. He was not trying to harm Waverly. He had not examined his own assumptions carefully enough to know that was what he was doing. He simply recorded what he had seen through the lens that his years of success had ground into his perception, the lens that measured a man by how forcefully he took up space. The evaluation was marked as mixed. The promotion was delayed. By the time the review board reconvened, Waverly had accepted a civilian offer and left the service. Holloway never knew. He filed hundreds of evaluations over the years. He did not track outcomes. He trusted his own judgment and moved to the next thing, which was always there, always pressing, always demanding his attention. But somewhere in the architecture of his personality, beneath the polished boots and the rows of ribbons, and the voice that always knew what it wanted to say, there was a door Holloway kept firmly shut. And behind that door was the slow, unexamined awareness that confidence in the wrong hands functions like a knife capable of precision, capable of damage operated by someone who has never been asked to account for the cuts. He built the noise to keep the door closed. The voice, the command presence, the elaborate architecture of visible authority. It had served him well. For 17 years, it had served him extremely well. He had no way of knowing that the woman he had just pressed against a wall had read every page of his service record, had read Waverly's evaluation, had traced with the patient, methodical care of someone who considers incomplete information a professional failure the precise chain of decisions that had produced Captain Garrett Holloway as he currently existed. She had not come to destroy him. She had come because Cerberus deserved better. And because somewhere in the arc of a person's career, before the damage compounds too far, there is still a chance to redirect. She had come to see if that chance still existed. Strickland stood along the wall and watched. He had known Marin Voss for 11 years, not personally, but professionally, the way a person knows a force by its effects rather than its source. Their careers had crossed at the edges in the margins of classified documentation and flag-level briefings that mentioned her work without naming her directly. He had learned her name 4 years into his tenure as Commodore, when a routine review of Cerberus facility records led him into an architectural document so dense with original thinking that he spent an afternoon just trying to understand the first 30 pages. The name at the bottom was a lieutenant commander he had never heard of. The date was 2008. He had pulled her personnel file. What he found had reorganized several things he thought he understood about the relationship between rank and capability. When the directive came 3 months ago, Inspection pending observer role, only no disclosure. He recognized immediately what it meant. He had spent those 3 months watching his command deck with new eyes, trying to see it as she would see it when she arrived. He had not liked what he found. He watched now as Holloway held her against the wall, his voice a controlled, furious hiss. He watched her face. He watched the gray eyes hold steady, unrevealing, patient, doing their work. And he watched her right hand, still holding the tablet, still angled inward toward the confrontation. The amber light still pulsing. She was letting this happen. Not from helplessness. Strickland had read the supplementary documentation on Voss's qualifications. She had completed the Advanced Close Quarters Combat Curriculum at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado 15 years ago, and there was no reason to believe she had let that lapse. She had the training, the angle, and the positioning to redirect the situation in the first quarter second. She had chosen not to. The tablet was collecting data. The confrontation was data. Holloway's exact words. His voice registered the specific escalation from command to physical contact. All of it was being recorded, time-stamped, and preserved on a device that would eventually appear in a formal report addressed to offices that Holloway did not have the clearance to know existed. She was doing her job. The door behind Strickland was still open. He did not close it. He waited. The first sign was easy to miss. At 0741 in the far corner of the command deck, a secondary monitor flickered. Not dramatically, just a single frame of digital static there, and gone in less than a second, so brief that the technician sitting in front of it did not register it consciously. But Kepler saw it. He was watching the confrontation at the primary node. Like everyone else on the deck, he could not look away, but some peripheral mechanism in his attention had stayed trained on the systems. He saw the flicker. He saw which monitor it was. And he felt something drop quietly in his stomach. That monitor was part of the Protocol Omega monitoring chain. He did not know what Protocol Omega was technically. He knew what it did. Every technician at Cerberus was briefed on it during their first week, a theoretical failsafe designed to completely isolate the Cerberus network in the event of catastrophic external intrusion. It had never been activated. It existed at the edge of the facility's architecture, the way a fire extinguisher exists in a room, present, essential, and deeply unwelcome as a sign of anything. He pulled up the system diagnostic. What he saw made him look again, because he did not trust the first read. The Protocol Omega monitoring chain was showing a recursive anomaly. A data packet of a type associated with the Black Spear wargame scenario had been introduced into the primary simulation stream, and something in the way it was formatted had triggered a low-level flag in the Omega architecture. Not enough to activate anything, not yet, but enough to set a process running that was looping back on itself in a way that did not resolve. Like a small fire that had found the edge of a curtain. He reached for the internal comm panel to flag the duty officer. Then he stopped. Something made him stop. A combination of things: the amber light on the woman's tablet, the measured stillness with which Strickland stood motionless near the aft door, and some formless instinct that the situation in this room was already being managed at a level he could not see, kept his hand hovering above the comm panel for 3 full seconds without pressing anything. He lowered his hand. He pulled up the anomaly on his secondary screen where he could keep both visible at once. And he waited, and he watched, and he thought about the fact that the woman near the primary node had arrived before any of them, and had not once, in all the time he had been watching her, seemed surprised by anything. Last time, Holloway said. His voice had dropped to a register meant for her alone, though the room could still hear it. Identify yourself and your purpose, or I will have you placed in the brig before you can close that tablet. For the first time since he had pressed her against the wall, she moved, not to push back, not to deflect. She turned her head slightly enough to look directly at him, and her eyes found his with the same steady clarity as before. No anger, no performance of composure, just the clean, factual attention of someone making an assessment. She let the silence run for 2 full seconds, long enough to feel the weight of it. Then she said very quietly, "You gave a lawful order, Captain. I heard it." That was all. Something in Holloway's expression shifted at the edge, not a retreat exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected argument. He had expected offense. He had not expected acknowledgement in that form delivered in that register, calm as a recorded statement, free of any emotional weather. He took a half step back. It was at that precise moment that the first real alarm sounded. Not the flicker on Kepler's secondary monitor. Not the quiet error code running its recursive loop in a corner of the system architecture that nobody was watching. A real alarm pulling from deep in the facility's core monitoring array, A tone that none of the technicians had heard before, except in their onboarding documentation, a sound described in the training material with the technical neutrality of bureaucratic language, and received now in the actual room as something closer to a cold hand laid against the back of the neck. Every head came up. The primary holographic display, 30 feet wide, normally showing the serene cartography of the Pacific Fleet wargame, went wrong. Not all at once. One quadrant first dissolving into red static, while the other three held. Then a second. Then the third. The fourth hung on for another 2 seconds, the blue-green data stream still flowing before it too collapsed into the same churning noise. The synthesized voice came from everywhere at once. System integrity compromised, protocol Omega engaged, all command functions locked. Nobody moved. For a full second, nobody moved at all, because the mind sometimes needs a moment to accept that the word it just heard cannot mean what it appears to mean. Then Holloway broke for the command chair, and the room broke with him, and the chaos that followed had the character of intelligent people doing exactly the wrong things with great speed and conviction. And Cole Kepler at his secondary console in the rear of the command deck watched the woman in the olive-drab flight suit push herself carefully off the wall, straighten her flight suit with a single smooth motion, and turn to look at the collapsing holographic display with an expression of complete deliberate focus. Not surprise, not fear. The expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for the situation to arrive at exactly this point. The amber recording light on her tablet was still on. She had not put it away. The chaos organized itself the way panic always does, with great energy and no direction. Holloway reached the command chair and turned to face a room that had already begun to come apart. His senior technicians were at their primary console's fingers moving with the urgent, mechanical speed of people doing something, because doing something is the only available response to helplessness, regardless of whether that something has any chance of working. The holographic display was all red now, a wall of noise 30 feet wide. The Pacific Fleet wargame dissolved somewhere inside it like a ship consumed by fog. The synthesized voice returned. Containment, field breach imminent, core coolant systems offline. Evacuate, evacuate. The word evacuate landed differently than the other words. The other words had carried the emotional temperature of a recorded announcement, something that could be heard and processed and filed away as probably not as bad as it sounds. The word evacuate carried no such distance. It was a word that meant now. It was a word that it meant the building itself had become the problem. Lieutenant Shea, the duty officer, crossed to the main blast door in 4 strides and hit the emergency release. The hydraulic mechanism groaned. The door did not move. He hit the release again, both hands this time leaning into it with his full weight. Still nothing. He turned back to the room with an expression that communicated without words that the door had made a decision of its own. "Sir, we're locked in." His voice was steady. Credit to him for that. "Emergency release is not responding. The door is sealed under the Omega protocol." "Override it," Holloway said. "Oh, Sir, I can't. The Omega lock supersedes the emergency mechanical release. We'd need an external code authorization." "Then get me external comms." Shea crossed to the communications panel. 30 seconds of silence while he worked. "Then external comms are down, sir. The protocol has isolated us completely. No outbound signal." Holloway turned to the main engineering terminal. "Get me a systems architect on the internal line. Someone who can walk us through a manual Omega override." The technician at that station, Petty Officer Daskell, looked up from a console that had gone almost entirely dark. "Sir, the internal network is down inside the lockdown perimeter. I can't reach anyone outside this room." The countdown on the core coolant monitor read 8 minutes 12 seconds. 23 people, sealed inside a room that was preparing to vent several thousand liters of liquid helium into a closed environment. The quantum processing core that powered Cerberus required temperatures within a few degrees of absolute zero to function, and the cryogenic system that maintained those temperatures was built with the engineering conservatism of something that, if it fails, fails with total commitment. If Protocol Omega in its corrupted state misread the wargame's energy signatures as a real-world overload, and it would do what it was designed to do. It would vent. It would protect the core. It would not account for the people in the room. The air in the command deck had already dropped 2 degrees. Nobody had measured it. Everyone felt it. Holloway understood in this moment that he was out of his depth in a specific and irrevocable way. The problem in front of him was not a tactical problem. It was not a management problem. It was not any kind of problem that his years of experience had equipped him to solve. It was a systems architecture failure of a complexity that required a depth of knowledge he did not have and could not improvise his way around. He barked more orders. He could not stop himself. Orders were the only tool he had left, and the human organism does not abandon its tools simply because they have stopped working. He told Daskell to keep trying the internal network. He told Shay to find a way to signal through the blast door. He told two technicians to pull the physical manual on Protocol Omega from the facility's emergency documentation cabinet, a cabinet that when they opened it contained the exact 412-page manual none of them had read. The countdown read 7 minutes 40 seconds. Then Holloway made it worse. He had been watching Daskell's hands move uselessly over the dark console, watching the countdown numbers fall, watching his authority stripped away, layer by layer, by a crisis that did not care about rank. And something in him, the part that had survived 2 decades by acting decisively, by never being the man frozen in the moment, made a decision. "Override the Omega lockdown," he said. "Manual bypass. Do it now." Daskell turned from his console. "Sir, a manual bypass at this stage will interrupt the automatic recovery sequence. If Protocol Omega is already in a recursive loop, a forced override could—" "That is a direct order, Petty Officer." Daskell's hands moved. The override command entered the system at 0749. The countdown changed, not gradually, not with any warning. The display flickered once, a single hard blink, and the number on the core coolant monitor rewrote itself. 8 minutes, 12 seconds became 3 minutes, 4 seconds in the space of a heartbeat. The room went silent in a way that was different from every silence that had preceded it. This was the silence of people watching a number and understanding, without needing it, explain that the number had just become something categorically different. Daskell looked at Holloway. His face said everything he had been about to say before the direct order had stopped him from saying it. Holloway looked at the countdown. 3 minutes. 2 minutes 58. 2 minutes 56. He had not fixed the problem. He had made the problem nearly 3 times more lethal in under 4 seconds, with a direct order delivered in the full confidence of his authority, and the proof of it was counting down in red numerals on the display in front of him. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. This was the moment Kepler would remember it for the rest of his career, when the thing that had held Garrett Holloway together for 20 years simply was not there anymore. The framework of certainty, the architecture of command presence, the practiced posture of the man who always knew what to say next, it dissolved not with drama, not with any visible collapse, but with the specific quietness of a structure losing its load-bearing capacity. The commanding officer of NCTF-1 Cerberus stood at the center of his command deck with his mouth slightly open and no words behind it. 2 minutes 42 seconds. Maren Voss was already moving. Her movements were not rushed. They were something more useful than rushed. They were directed, stripped of every motion that was not necessary, carrying the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this scenario, not in drills, but in the deep architecture of how she thinks. She crossed the command deck diagonally, threading between clusters of technicians without looking at them, her eyes fixed on a destination on the far wall. She stopped at a secondary engineering terminal in the corner of the deck. Nobody had looked at this terminal all morning, not because it was hidden, it was visible to anyone who turned their head, but because it was not connected to the primary command systems. It had no holographic interface. It had no link to the facility's main operational network. It was a maintenance terminal, the kind of access point that exists in every complex installation for low-level diagnostics and hardware monitoring, the kind of thing that gets used twice a year and otherwise sits dormant and overlooked in whatever corner the original installation team decided was least in the way. The screen was dark. Voss reached into a pouch on the left thigh of her flight suit and removed a small coiled cable. She connected one end to a shielded port below the terminal's main panel, a port that Kepler, watching from across the room, did not recognize from any documented specification he had ever read. She connected the other end to her tablet. The terminal screen came on, not with red error codes, not with cascading failure messages, with clean operational blue. 2 minutes 19 seconds. Kepler stared at the terminal. In a room where every primary system had been locked or crashed or consumed by the Omega Protocol's corrupted logic, this one dormant maintenance terminal in the far corner was awake and functional and apparently had no interest in the disaster that had claimed everything around it. Holloway noticed her. He crossed toward her, his face carrying an expression that had moved through alarm and was settling out of habit into the posture of command. "What are you doing?" His voice had lost its earlier precision. The edges were fraying. "Get away from that terminal. You'll compromise the recovery sequence." She did not look up. Get away from the terminal. That is a direct order, she said without raising her eyes from the tablet. I heard you, Captain. The same words, the same register, the same acknowledgement that contained in its measured calm a complete refusal. Holloway stood 2 feet behind her and had nowhere to go. He could not physically stop her. Whatever authority he retained in this room was diminishing by the second and did not include laying hands on her a second time while the room watched. He could not override what she was doing because he did not understand what she was doing. He could not appeal to a higher authority because there was no communication with anyone outside the sealed room. He stood behind her and watched. And the watching for a man like Garrett Holloway was its own exposure. 1 minute, 51 seconds. Her fingers had started moving across the tablet surface. Not typing, he had seen fast typing before, and this was not that. This was something with a different quality, a different rhythm. Fluid, expansive. The motion of someone speaking a language rather than entering instructions, the difference between composing a sentence and looking up a word in a dictionary. Lines of raw code scrolled across her screen, dense and layered more architectural notation than standard programming language, the kind of text that looks to the uninitiated less like software and more like the compressed record of a very long and very serious argument with a complex system. Kepler turned to his own console and tried to trace what the maintenance terminal was doing. What he found did not make immediate sense to him. The terminal had opened a direct interface with the facility's lowest level architecture, not the operational systems that Protocol Omega had locked, but the foundational layer beneath them, the layer that predated Cerberus in its current form, the original architecture. Someone had built a pathway into this layer that bypassed every lockout the Omega protocol could impose, because the Omega protocol had been written on top of this layer and therefore could not see beneath it. It was like trying to lock a room from the inside when someone had built a passage through the floor. The pathway had been there since the beginning, since the facility was built. It had been placed in the original architecture deliberately by whoever wrote that architecture, and it had been waiting unused and invisible for 17 years. 1 minute, 22 seconds. Kepler looked at Voss. He looked at the cable connecting her tablet to the port that appeared in no documentation. He thought about the credentials the overnight security officer had read at 0622, the expression on the officer's face. Something very large and very quiet settled into place in his understanding. He turned back to his console and began, without drawing attention to himself, to trace the active data streams feeding into the Protocol Omega monitoring chain. He was not a systems architect. He did not have the depth of knowledge to do what she was doing. But he had spent 3 days turning over a problem in the base code architecture, and that problem had led him into a section of the facility's network that he now understood was more important than it had appeared. He found it in 4 minutes, except he did not have 4 minutes. And so he found it faster running on the particular clarity that comes when the alternative to finding something is not finding it in time. A secondary server in the facility's Eastern rack cluster, still active, still pushing data into the Omega chain, despite the lockdown. Operating through a maintenance pathway that Protocol Omega had missed, because the protocol had been written to seal primary and secondary data channels, and this pathway had been reclassified at some point in the past 2 years as tertiary. He could not stop the server through his console. He did not have the administrative access. But he could isolate the rack cluster from the local network switch, a physical action requiring him to leave his console and cross 30 feet of command deck to a network hardware panel on the far wall. He stood up. Nobody was watching him. He crossed the room. He opened the hardware panel, found the switch for the Eastern rack cluster, and flipped it. The data stream stopped. The countdown, which had been at 1 minute, 11 seconds slowed, not stopped, but the rate of deterioration reduced visibly measurably, buying seconds that had not existed before he crossed the room. Kepler closed the hardware panel and walked back to his console and sat down and said nothing to anyone because he had no language yet for what he had just done or why it had worked. Across the room at the maintenance terminal, Voss's hands did not pause. She had not watched him cross the room. She had not watched him open the panel. But when the data stream from the Eastern cluster stopped, something on her tablet screen changed, and her motion altered the same language, but moving in a different direction now, as though a door had opened that had not been opened before. 53 seconds. Then something happened on the primary holographic display. In the churning red static, a single thin line of white light appeared. Precise, deliberate, drawing itself slowly from one edge of a small circular boundary outward, tracing a perfect circle, maybe 4 feet across on the 30-foot display, pushing the red noise back from its perimeter with the clean logic of a mathematical proof. The room noticed. The frantic motion at the primary console slowed, not because anyone had given an order, because the human eye in the presence of order emerging from chaos stops involuntarily. It cannot help itself. Order is what the eye has been waiting for. The circle held. A second line appeared, beginning to construct a larger shape inside the red storm. 41 seconds. In this moment, this specific suspended moment between the circle of white light and the continuing countdown, Garrett Holloway did something he had not done in a room full of people in 20 years of service. He sat down on the floor. Not a collapse, not a dramatic fall. He simply lowered himself until his back was against the base of the command console, and his legs were in front of him, and the floor was holding him in a way that the room and the rank and the uniform no longer could. He looked at his hands, the hands that had grabbed her arm, that had pressed her against the wall, that had entered the override command, that took 8 minutes and made them 3, and he looked at them the way a man looks at something he no longer fully recognizes. The room around him was still moving. Shay at the blast door, Daskell at the dark console. The crew doing their frantic things. Nobody was watching him. He was, for the first time in a very long time, invisible. He said one word, very quietly, in the register that belongs only to the private interior of a person not meant to reach anyone else. Nora, his daughter, 9 years old. She would be sitting at the kitchen table right now in a house 12 miles from this building, eating cereal she had poured herself because she had learned not to wait for her father on mornings when he left early. She had learned a great many accommodations quietly without being asked to. 33 seconds. Voss heard it. Her fingers did not stop. The rhythm of her work did not break. But for exactly half a second, not a full second half, the motion of her hands slowed by a fraction, not visible to anyone standing at a normal distance. Kepler saw it. He was close enough, watching with the specific attention of someone who had understood that what was happening at the maintenance terminal was the only thing in the room that mattered. He saw the half second. He registered what it meant. He did not say anything. He turned back to his screen and kept the knowledge to himself, the way you keep something that belongs to the moment it occurred and would be diminished by being spoken aloud. Voss's hands resumed their full rhythm. The code continued. She had allowed herself half a second to be a person, and she had returned herself to the task, because the task was what 23 people needed from her, and she had never in her career confused what she needed with what the situation required. But Kepler had seen it, and it was the only time across the entire morning in the 6 days that followed that Maren Voss was anything other than precisely composed in view of another human being. 22 seconds. Then the first alarm went quiet, not gradually, not with a diminuendo. It stopped the way a sound stops when its source is removed, leaving a silence that felt, after so long, almost physical. Then the evacuation warning ceased mid-word, the synthesized voice cutting off with the abruptness of something switched off. The emergency lighting cycling between harsh functional red and full darkness in a way that had been steadily pushing the room's fear upward, stabilized, held, then slowly shifted back through amber toward the calm operational blue of the room's natural state. 14 seconds. The countdown on the core coolant monitor slowed, stopped, cleared, and showed a normal operational status. The holographic display took another 40 seconds. The circle of white light expanded until it reached the edges of the display, and then the red static, as though it had lost the argument it had been making, collapsed inward and vanished. The Pacific Fleet wargame reappeared incomplete in some elements, still rebuilding from cached data, but recognizably present the blue-green streams resuming their ordinary motion. The core coolant system's hum returned, deep, reassuring. The sound of a system pulled back from the edge. The total time from the moment Voss connected her cable to the moment the last alarm cleared was 87 seconds. Kepler counted it afterward from the terminal logs. 87 seconds. She had found it in the middle of all that. It was small, the kind of thing you would not see unless you knew to look for it, and you would only know to look for it if you understood the Omega architecture at the foundational level, which required having written that architecture in the first place. A data packet formatted with a precision that was not accidental, introduced into the protocol Omega monitoring chain through the maintenance pathway in the Eastern Rack cluster. The packet was designed to look like a standard Black Spear wargame transmission. It was not. It had been modified at the packet level to include a specific error signature that the Omega architecture would interpret as the beginning of an external intrusion event. One packet, precisely formatted, introduced at a specific time. Not a bug, not a system error, not the recursive anomaly that could develop on its own in a complex architecture under operational stress. A key, inserted by someone who knew which lock it would open. She filed the data, noted the timestamp, and continued her work because the finding of the cause did not change the urgency of the solution. But she noted it with the care of someone who understood that what she had just found was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a different one, a story that would require a different kind of attention. Someone in this facility had deliberately broken Cerberus. The question was not whether. The question was who. And the more important question, the one she had learned across a long career to ask before the obvious one, was why. The silence that fell on the command deck after the last alarm cleared was unlike the silences that had preceded it. The silence at the beginning of the crisis had been the silence of shock. The silence in the middle had been the silence of people doing inadequate things with great urgency. This silence was different. It was the silence of 23 people who had just watched something that exceeded every category available to them for understanding it. Voss disconnected her cable, coiled it, replaced it in the thigh pouch with the practiced efficiency of someone storing equipment that has done its job. She straightened, looked at the holographic display for a measured moment, and then turned to face the room. Holloway was on the floor. When she turned and looked at him, and she looked at him directly without evasion, without the carefully maintained peripheral awareness she had employed all morning, he became aware of her gaze and began the process of standing, the motion effortful, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical mechanics of getting up from a floor. He stood. He faced her. The man who had pressed this woman against a wall 40 minutes ago, who had told her this room was not a library for people like her, who had used every instrument of authority he possessed to communicate that she did not belong here. That man was visible in the person standing before her, but only as an outline. The interior had been rearranged. She looked at him with an expression that was not soft and was not hard. It was the expression of a person who has arrived at the end of a long and difficult calculation and found that the answer, while correct, carries its own weight. Then Strickland came through the blast door. Strickland had been at the external control panel in the corridor where the Omega lockdown could be overridden by Commodore-level authorization once the internal pressure readings confirmed that the core coolant system was no longer in a failure state. When the readings normalized, he had entered the code. He walked through the door with the measured pace of a man who had watched everything on the remote monitor and had a reasonable sense of the room he was about to enter. He was accompanied by 2 Marines from the base security detail. He had called for them before entering, not because he expected violence, but because the next several minutes required a formality that the situation demanded. He looked at the room, the shell-shocked faces of the crew, the primary console slowly rebooting, the holographic display rebuilding itself from cached data. He noted Holloway standing near the command platform with the stillness of a man who has run out of motion, and he looked at Marin Voss standing near the primary command node, tablet in hand, waiting. He crossed the room directly to her. His path did not deviate. He did not stop to address Holloway. He walked to her with the directness of someone who knows exactly where authority resides in a given room. When he stopped, he drew himself to attention. The Marines behind him did the same. The salute he executed was not the casual salute of service equals greeting each other in a corridor. It was the salute of a subordinate acknowledging a superior of significant rank held for the full count, clean and unambiguous. "Vice Admiral Voss," he said. His voice carried across the room without effort. He had not lowered it. He was making this the most public statement possible. "My apologies for the conditions of your inspection, ma'am. I was not informed of your arrival date." The words Vice Admiral entered the room the way a change in atmospheric pressure enters a room, not heard so much as felt the air rearranging itself around the new information. Kepler looked up from his console. Shea, still standing near the blast door, turned his head. Every technician on the deck stopped what they were doing, and Garrett Holloway, standing 4 feet from the woman he had pinned against a server rack bulkhead less than an hour ago, felt the floor move. Not literally, but the sensation was close enough to be indistinguishable. The slow, vertiginous drop of a man whose understanding of where he is standing has undergone a complete and irreversible revision. He had not just insulted a superior officer. He had physically assaulted a flag officer. He had pressed a vice admiral against a wall and told her she did not belong in a room she had built. Voss returned Strickland's salute with the brevity of someone for whom the gesture is a transaction rather than a performance. "Commodore," she said. Her voice was the same it had been all morning, even steady, carrying no weather. "Your facility has a flaw in its core architecture." She glanced at the holographic display, now mostly restored. "Protocol Omega contains a recursive error loop that can be triggered by a specifically formatted data packet introduced through the maintenance pathway in the Eastern Rack cluster. The packet mimics a black spear transmission signature. The Omega architecture reads it as an external intrusion and initiates a full lockdown, which it then interprets as confirmation of the attack, compounding the lockdown until it approaches a core event. She paused. That is the technical flaw. There is a second flaw. Her eyes moved to Holloway, held him in that steady gray attention for a moment he could not find the resources to look away from. Your command staff was not prepared for a systems-level cascade failure. They are trained to operate this facility. They are not trained to understand it. When operation became impossible, they had nothing to fall back on. That is a critical vulnerability, one that cannot be resolved with better equipment. She did not raise her voice. She did not add anything that would have constituted accusation or performance. She stated the condition with the factual temperature of a physician describing an illness to a consulting team. The condition exists, here are its parameters. Here is what it means. Strickland moved to a data terminal along the wall and entered a command. A holographic file appeared above it, large enough for the room to read. The crew read it. Kepler read each line with the slow attention of someone taking the measure of a thing and discovering it is larger than the last measure suggested. The doctoral degrees from MIT and Caltech. The classified program qualifications listed by name, but redacted in their contents. The operational history dense with classified designations and spare in detail, because the detail was not for him. The awards, which ran long, and the current title, Vice Admiral, United States Navy, Deputy Director of Cyber Operations, Naval Command, third in the chain of command for every cyber operation the United States Navy ran anywhere on Earth. And then in a section of the file, Strickland had specifically authorized to be displayed one line of historical record. Original architect NCT F1 Cerberus. Design period 2006 to 2008. Rank at time of design Lieutenant Commander. She had built this room before she was a commander, before she was a captain, before any of the ranks that had followed in the years since she had sat with the foundational design of this facility and written it from the ground up, including the maintenance terminal in the far corner that nobody used, and the port below its panel that appeared in no documentation, and the pathway through the floor that bypassed every lockout Protocol Omega could impose, because she had written Protocol Omega and therefore knew exactly where its sight lines ended. Kepler looked at the source code annotation he had half seen on her tablet screen that morning. He had not been able to read it at the time. He understood now what it would have said. At the far edge of the command deck near the Eastern Rack cluster, whose switch he had flipped 45 minutes ago, Lieutenant Brennan Cross stood with his back against the wall. He was 28 years old, and he looked at this moment somewhat younger than that, the specific younger that appears on a person's face when the full consequence of a decision has arrived and proved to be larger than the model used to make it. He had been at Cerberus for 11 months. By every technical measure available, he was one of the most gifted systems analysts the facility had ever employed. He had an instinctive grasp of network architecture that his supervisors had recognized, and then, over the course of those 11 months, consistently found reasons to overlook, because the conclusions his understanding led him to were conclusions that required action, and action required acknowledging problems, and acknowledging problems required a kind of institutional courage that the culture of this facility under its current command did not reward. He had filed 3 formal reports. The first identified the recursive error potential in the Protocol Omega monitoring chain. The second identified the Eastern Rack cluster's reclassification from secondary to tertiary status as a security vulnerability. The third requested a formal architectural review of the facility's foundational code layer. All 3 had been reviewed by Holloway. All 3 had been returned with a notation that read in varying forms, not a priority at this time. Cross looked at the holographic service record floating above Strickland's terminal. He read the line about the original architect. He looked at the woman near the primary command node. He thought about the packet he had introduced into the monitoring chain at 0653 this morning. Small, precise, formatted with the specific error signature he had identified in his first report 9 months ago, the report that had been returned marked not a priority. He had not wanted to destroy Cerberus. He had wanted someone from outside to look at what he had found. He had wanted the system to fail in a controlled way safely with enough drama to require an external review. He had not understood that the Omega architecture would accelerate the way it did. He had not known about the feedback loop Holloway's override command would create. He had not known that the countdown would drop from 8 minutes to 3. He had not known any of those things because the 3 reports explaining them had been returned to him unread. He stood against the wall and understood with the specific clarity that comes only after consequence exactly what he had done and what it had nearly cost. 23 people. He had been trying to force an inspection. An inspection was standing in the room. The inspection had already been coming, already in progress. The data it needed already collected on a tablet with an amber recording light before he had ever introduced the packet into the monitoring chain. He had nearly killed 23 people, and he had done it for a reason that had already been rendered unnecessary. Nobody had looked at him yet. Voss had. She had looked at him once briefly in the seconds since Strickland opened the file once with those gray eyes, the way you look at a variable you have already accounted for in your calculation. Not with accusation, not with anger, with the focused attention of someone who understood already the full weight of what he had done and the full weight of why. He stayed where he was, against the wall, waiting. Voss crossed the room to Holloway, not the full distance. She stopped 8 feet away near the edge of the command platform and stood in a posture that was direct and without ceremony, the posture of someone who has decided that formal architecture is not useful here and has set it aside. "Captain Holloway," she said. Her voice had changed by some fraction that was difficult to name. Not warmer, not softer, but less distant, as though the instrument had been recalibrated for a different kind of precision. "I have been conducting a formal review of NCT F1 Cerberus for 93 days. The review was initiated following a pattern of retained grievances in this facility's internal reporting system, 3 formal technical reports filed by junior personnel between January and October of this year, all 3 returned without substantive review." She paused the way a careful person pauses when they want to be certain the next thing they say is the exact thing they mean. "The review identified a command culture that had mistaken volume for clarity and visibility for competence. It identified a pattern in which the most technically capable personnel were systematically devalued in favor of a personnel whose primary skill was occupying authority with confidence. It identified a facility being operated by people who were excellent at using its systems and had never been required to understand them." Holloway was listening in the way a person listens when they have decided that whatever comes next is something they owe the speaker the courtesy of receiving fully. "Those are institutional failures," Voss continued. "Institutional failures have institutional causes, but they also have human causes, and the human cause in this case has a 14-month history and a name." She did not say his name. She did not need to. "You are not a stupid man, Captain. You are not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because what comes next is not a condemnation of your character. A beat. It is an accounting of your decisions, which is a different thing." She moved slowly along the edge of the command platform as she spoke, not pacing but shifting position the way a person moves when thinking and talking at the same time, and the thinking is the larger operation. "In 14 months of command, you returned 3 formal technical reports without substantive review. In 14 months, you held 4 formal performance evaluations of junior personnel, and in each one ratings for technical depth were consistently lower than ratings for command presence, regardless of individual technical contribution. In 14 months, not one junior officer under your command was formally recommended for advanced systems training, despite the fact that this facility exists specifically to develop that expertise." She stopped. "These are not character flaws. They are the logical outcome of a set of beliefs about what authority looks like and where competence lives. Beliefs that you have held and that this institution has rewarded you for holding for a very long time." Holloway's jaw moved, not to speak to absorb. The way a structure absorbs a load, it was not built to carry, redistributing the weight through whatever material is available. Voss looked at him steadily. "I know about Waverly." The name entered the room differently than any other word spoken in it that morning. Small, unremarkable on its surface. But the way Holloway received it, the slight contraction across the chest, the eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before returning, told everyone watching that the word had landed in a place that had been waiting for it. "I know what you wrote in 2017. I know what the evaluation said. I know what it cost him." She let those 3 sentences stand. "I also know that you wrote it in good faith, that you believed what you wrote, that you were not trying to harm him. You were assessing what you had observed, and what you had observed was filtered through a set of assumptions about what a capable officer looks like. Assumptions so deeply embedded in this institution that most people who carry them never become aware that they are carrying them." Holloway's voice, when it came, was stripped of its professional register. Just a man's voice asking a question he had carried without knowing it was a question. Does he know? Voss held his gaze. She did not hesitate, and she did not look away, and she did not soften what she said next, because she had decided across 93 days of considering this man and this moment that the truth was the only thing she had to offer him that was worth anything. No, and it's too late to ask. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Kepler counted them without meaning to. Holloway nodded once, a small motion. The nod of a man receiving something he had asked for and finding it exactly as heavy as he had feared. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. And in his face, in the space where the armor used to be, something settled. Not peace, not yet nothing as clean as that, but the beginning of a reckoning with a thing that had gone unreckoned with for 8 years. The beginning which is the necessary condition for anything that follows it. He reached up with his right hand. His fingers found the rank insignia on his collar, the silver eagle of a Navy captain, worn for 4 years earned across 2 decades. He unpinned it slowly. The motion was deliberate, not performed for the room, not theatrical. The action of a man doing something he has decided must be done without pretense. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the edge of the command platform console. It made a small sound against the surface, barely audible. He straightened, looked at Voss. She met his gaze. She did not look at the insignia on the console. She did not mark the gesture with satisfaction or vindication because she felt neither, and because performing either would have been a diminishment of what the gesture had cost him. Commodore Strickland will escort you to your quarters, she said. The formal process will proceed through normal channels. The official report will reflect a failure to manage a critical systems event which is accurate. A pause. It will not reflect this morning's conduct in full. That determination was mine to make, and I have made it. Holloway looked at her with an expression that was not gratitude. Exactly, gratitude would have been too simple, too clean for what was in his face but was something in the same territory. The expression of a man being given something he knows he has not earned by someone who has decided to give it anyway, and who understands the difference between what is owed and what is right. He nodded. He turned. He walked toward the aft corridor with the steady pace of a man who is done performing his walk for an audience whose footsteps no longer announce anything. Strickland fell in beside him without a word, which was the correct thing to do. Voss turned. Brennan Cross was still against the wall. He had not moved since Strickland opened the file. He was 28 years old, and he looked at entirely the specific younger that appears on a person's face when consequence has arrived and proved to be larger than the model used to calculate it. Voss crossed the room to him. She stopped 4 feet away and looked at him with the same deliberate attention she had brought to everything this morning, complete without rush and carrying in its completeness something that was not judgment but was not absent of it either. Cross did not look away. He was whatever else might be said about him, not a person who looked away from things. The packet in the Eastern Cluster monitoring chain, she said. 0653. It was not a question. He had understood from the moment she looked at him after Strickland opened the file that it was not a question. Yes, ma'am, he said. Walk me through the reasoning. He did. In 4 minutes of precise, controlled language, he described the 3 reports and the 3 rejections, and the 9 months of watching a vulnerability exist in the foundational architecture of a critical facility, while every available channel for correcting it led to a notation that read, not a priority. He described the packet, the formatting, the specific error signature, the calculation he had made about what a controlled failure would force. He described what he had not understood about the feedback loop, about the acceleration, about what 3 minutes means when 23 people cannot open a door. He did not offer mitigation. He did not claim that the outcome justified the method or that the urgency of the problem excused the risk he had created. He was precise and direct, and he did not look away, and when he finished, he stood in the same posture and waited. Voss was quiet for a moment. You were right about the vulnerability, she said. Yes, ma'am. You were wrong about the method. Yes, ma'am. Those 2 things are not in tension with each other. She held his gaze. Being right about a problem does not give you the authority to create a larger one in service of correcting it. You nearly killed 23 people because you had exhausted the legitimate channels available to you and decided that an illegitimate one was therefore acceptable. It was not. The gap between those 2 positions is not a gray area. It is the entire question of what kind of professional you are going to be for the next 30 years. But Cross received this the way he had received everything she had said, without deflection. I know that, ma'am. I believe you do, she said. It is the reason I am not recommending court-martial proceedings. Something shifted in his face. Not relief would have been the wrong response, and his instincts were good enough to know it. Something closer to the awareness of weight, of what was being extended and what it meant. You will be transferred out of this command structure effective immediately to a developmental assignment under Ensign Kepler's direct supervision in the new systems architecture program. She paused. That is not a demotion. It is a placement based on where your skills are needed and where you are most likely to do the work correctly. How you use it is your decision. She looked at him for one more moment, and in that look was something she had not offered anyone else in the room today, a specific investment, the attention of someone choosing to put something forward rather than simply evaluate it. The next time you identify a critical vulnerability, you will find a way to be heard that does not require the ceiling to fall in. When the official channels fail you, and they sometimes will, you will find someone with the authority to open a new one. A beat. That is what authority is for. She turned away. Cross stood against the wall and breathed. Kepler was still at his console. He had been there through both conversations, listening with the attention of someone being taught something that has not been formally named as a lesson, which is the only kind of lesson that tends to stay. Voss crossed the command deck to him. She sat down without ceremony in the empty seat beside his console, the seat that normally belonged to the duty supervisor. She sat the way a person sits when they intend to stay for a moment, simply present. She looked at his screen. The Eastern Rack Cluster, she said. He looked at her, not certain yet what was being asked. You isolated the switch at 0829, she said. Manual, physical access to the hardware panel. You identified which cluster was feeding the active data stream into the Omega chain despite the lockdown, and you isolated it. Yes, ma'am. How did you find it? I'd been working on a problem in the base code architecture for about 3 days. It led me into the maintenance pathway network. I didn't know exactly what I was looking at, but I knew the Eastern cluster was behaving differently from the others. Voss nodded slowly. What was the original problem, the one you'd been working on for 3 days? He pulled up the diagnostic he had been running when she walked in at 0622. He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it for 15 seconds. Then she looked at him. How long have you been assigned to this facility? 7 months, ma'am. And you found this in 7 months. It was not a question that required an answer, but he answered it anyway because the alternative felt like presumption. I wasn't looking for it specifically. It presented itself while I was looking at something else. A slight change crossed her face, not a smile exactly, but its leading edge. That is the correct way to find things, she said. She stood. She looked at his screen for one more moment, making a final notation in a document she had been compiling for a long time. There is a formal process for the next several weeks. You will be asked to provide a technical account of your actions this morning for the after-action report. Be precise. Be complete. Do not minimize the Eastern cluster isolation. It was consequential. She straightened her flight suit. After that finish, the problem you have been working on for 3 days. The one that led you into the maintenance pathway network. I'd like to read the findings. She said it as though it were a minor administrative matter, as though she were noting a scheduling preference rather than asking a 24-year-old ensign to submit technical findings to the third-ranking cyber operations officer in the United States Navy. Yes, ma'am, he said. She nodded and turned back toward the center of the room. She walked the decks of NC and TF-1 Cerberus for 6 days. Not as an admiral conducting a visible inspection, though the inspection was technically still in progress. She did it the way she did most things, without announcement, without the organizational theater that tends to attach itself to senior presence in a facility, without the behavioral adjustments that a visible authority figure produces in the people around them, simply by being visible. She arrived before the crew each morning. She was present when they left each evening. In the hours between, she moved through the facility with a pace that was deliberate and purposeful, stopping at a console when something on the screen caught her attention, sitting beside a technician and asking a question, reading documentation in the room Strickland had arranged for her, and then walking back out to compare what the documentation said with what the systems were actually doing. She did not lecture. She had abandoned that practice in her early 30s when she understood that information transferred through lecture persists at roughly the same rate as information written in water. What persisted, what actually changed the way a person engaged with a system or a problem, was a question asked at the right moment, in the right register, that the person had to answer from their own understanding rather than from received instruction. She asked questions with the patience of someone who had learned that the pause before an answer is not emptiness. It is thinking. And thinking given sufficient space tends to arrive somewhere useful. On the third day, she found Kepler at his console 2 hours before the morning watch began. He had a coffee and a problem, and the expression of someone who is slightly further into something than they expected to be and is not unhappy about it. She sat beside him. He had finished the diagnostic problem he had been working on when she arrived, the one that had led him into the maintenance pathway network, the one that had given him the knowledge to isolate the eastern rat cluster at the critical moment. He had not stopped there. Following the thread from that problem had led him into a section of the foundational code layer adjacent to the maintenance pathways, and in that section he had found something he could not describe to himself with precision, something that felt less like a flaw and more like an intention. A structure placed there deliberately by someone who was thinking several layers ahead of the documentation. He turned his screen toward her without being asked. She looked at it for a long time, longer than she had looked at anything this week. He watched her face and saw something he had not seen there before. Not the analytical stillness of assessment, but something closer to the expression of a person encountering something unexpected in a place they know very well. The specific recognition that arrives when someone else has found their way by their own path to a place you thought only you had been. "This is original," she said. He was not sure for a moment what she meant. Then he understood. She was not describing what was on the screen. She was describing him. "I don't think I found anything that wasn't already there," he said carefully. "No," she agreed, "but you found it." She looked at the screen for a moment longer. The things that are already there are always there. They do not reveal themselves equally to everyone who passes them. What you found is not the object. It's the capacity to find it. She stood. She looked at him with the same gray eyes that had been steady all week, that had held the same quality of complete and deliberate attention across 6 days and an inspection, and a crisis, and two of the most consequential conversations she had conducted in recent memory. "Finish it," she said. "Document everything. Every step of the reasoning, every dead end, every place you turned around and found a different path. Not because I need the documentation, because the documentation is the work, and the work is the only thing that lasts." He would think about that sentence for a long time. He would think about it at 24 and at 34 and at 44 in facilities not yet built, in crises not yet arrived, in rooms full of people who did not yet know what they needed to know. It would not always tell him what to do, but it would always tell him that the question was worth the effort of sitting still long enough to find the answer. On the 6th day, she signed the final inspection report and submitted it through the appropriate channels. She met with Strickland for 40 minutes, going through the formal documentation with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the quality of the paperwork is the quality of the thinking, and that both matter more than they are given credit for in an institution that tends to measure success by outcomes and overlook the reasoning that produced them. She returned the room to its intended purpose before she left. She did not make a ceremony of her departure. She badged out at 0651 on a Friday morning while most of the facility was still arriving. Kepler was at his console. He was the only one who saw her go. She stopped at the door for a moment and looked back at the command deck, the servers humming, the holographic display showing its calm operational landscape, the blue light falling across the raised platform where Holloway had once stood, announcing himself to a room that had organized itself around his arrival. She did not look at the primary command node. She looked at the maintenance terminal in the far corner, dark again, dormant again, sitting in its corner, with the ordinary invisibility of something that does not need to be noticed in order to work. Then she went through the door. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at the facility, no return address, official naval service postmark routing through a distribution office that processed correspondence for offices whose addresses were not publicly listed. Inside was a data slate, matte black, no markings, the kind of device that could have belonged to anyone. Kepler's name was on the internal addressing. He took it to his console and turned it on. The primary file was the foundational source code for NCT F1 Cerberus, all of it from the original 2006 design through every revision across 17 years. Annotated throughout in the compressed technical shorthand of someone who thinks precisely and writes the same way, marginal notes explaining design decisions, observations about the way a system's architecture shapes the behavior of the people who use it in ways the architects often do not anticipate and sometimes never learn. At the bottom of the architectural documentation in the section containing the original design notes for the maintenance terminal and the pathway below the panel and the back door through the floor that had been waiting 17 years to be used, there was a single line not in technical shorthand. For whoever finds this broken first, and for whoever keeps it whole. The second file was an audio recording, 43 seconds. Her voice the same register she had used all week, even deliberate free of weather. He listened to it once. Then he sat with the console dark and the room doing its ordinary work and the hum of the servers constant in the air. Then he listened again. The question isn't what you can do. Anyone who has worked hard enough at something can eventually demonstrate what they can do. The question is who you are not hearing in the room around you. The question is who has been filing the reports and receiving the rejections and working in the corner with the lights off because nobody thought to turn them on. That is the question that determines what the room becomes. Not the skill of the person at the center, the attention of the person at the center to the people they have not yet noticed. Find them before the ceiling falls. That is the work. The data slate went into his left desk drawer below his console within reach. He did not display it. He did not tell many people about it. It was not a trophy. It was a set of tools left by someone who had finished the work they came to do and decided before leaving to make sure the tools were in good hands. The plaque appeared 2 weeks after that. Nobody announced it. Nobody made a ceremony. One morning it was simply there affixed to the bulkhead at the edge of the server rack where a woman in an olive drab flight suit had stood on a Monday morning in November while a captain told her she did not belong in his room. Small, discreet, the kind of thing you had to be close to read. It said, efficiency is its own form of elegance. Below the engraving, a date, the date of the inspection. And below the date, the initials MVI, which the crew came to understand over time were not simply the initials of the person who had stood here. They were a standard. A question asked permanently of everyone who passed. Are you listening to the room Garrett Holloway served the remainder of his career at a logistics coordination office in Tucson, Arizona, where the work was administrative and the audience was small and the performance had nowhere to go. It took time, longer than he would have wished, and he had enough honesty left by that point to understand that the length of the time was appropriate. He learned things in Tucson that Cerberus had never taught him. He learned the name of the most capable supply clerk on the base, a woman named Albrecht, who ran the procurement network with an encyclopedic knowledge of logistics that she communicated in short, precise sentences to whoever happened to ask. He learned the name of the civilian contractor who had been maintaining the facility's aging infrastructure for 11 years and who could tell you, without consulting any documentation, the load capacity of every structural junction in the building. He learned to notice them. He learned what noticing cost and what it returned. He did not find peace quickly. He was not built for quick peace, and the accounting he had to do was not a small one. But he found something that is the necessary precondition for peace, the willingness to sit with the truth of what had been and not require it to be otherwise. He sent one letter in the second year of his assignment. It went through official channels to a distribution office Strickland had quietly provided, which routed to offices Holloway did not have the clearance to name. The letter was 2 paragraphs. He had written it many times before arriving at the version he sent, and that version was shorter than any of the earlier ones because he had learned slowly and at cost that the right number of words for a given thing is rarely as many as you think you need. He did not receive a written reply. 3 weeks after he sent it, a file appeared in his official digital inbox from a distribution office he did not recognize. It contained a single piece of documentation, a technical schematic he did not fully understand annotated in the precise shorthand of someone who thinks in layers and writes accordingly. At the top of the first page above the schematic, one handwritten line, "Start here." He did not know what it meant technically. He was not a systems architect and did not have the foundational knowledge to parse what the schematic described. But he understood what it meant with the part of himself that had been opened by 2 years of sitting in a logistics depot learning to listen, which was not a technical part, but was, he had come to believe, the more important one. It meant the accounting was not finished. It never fully finishes. But it can be redirected. The direction is forward. The work is to begin. He printed the schematic and put it on his desk. He looked at it every morning. The room at NCTF1 servers continued its work. The servers hummed. The holographic display showed its calm operational cartography. The crew moved through the blue light with a different quality of attention than they had before the Monday in November, the attention of people who have been shown by demonstration rather than instruction that the person standing quietly in the corner may be the most important person in the room. They did not always remember this. They were human. And the pressure of institutional life and the pull of old habits and the comfort of familiar assumptions did not dissolve in a single morning, however consequential that morning had been. But they remembered more than they would have otherwise. And the remembering distributed across a room full of people who carried it individually and practiced it imperfectly was enough. The plaque at Admiral's Corner accumulated small marks over the years, the light patina of a surface touched often by passing hands, people trailing a finger across the text as they moved past a gesture that meant different things to different people, but tended toward the same territory. A reminder, a question, a standard that did not lower itself to meet you. Are you doing the work? Are you listening to the room? Is there someone in the corner with the lights off who you have not yet turned toward? The answers change. The question does not. That is what makes it a standard rather than a memory. The memory fades, but the question stays in the room, patient as code running in the background, waiting for whoever is ready to hear it. The story traveled the way such stories travel through encrypted channels and careful conversations in wardrooms, and the particular informal network of people who work in spaces that do not appear on public maps. It was told accurately in some places, and with embellishment in others, as all stories are the additions clustering around the technical details, because technical details are where imagination most easily fills the gaps left by classification. What did not get embellished because there was no need to was the image at the center of it. A woman in a plain flight suit standing against a cold wall while a room full of decorated officers watched, and then when the ceiling came down, being the only person in that room who knew exactly what to do. Not because she had been given more authority, not because she had been given more time, because 17 years before that morning when she was a lieutenant commander in a facility that did not yet exist, she had understood that the measure of a system is not how it performs when everything is working. It is what it reaches for when everything breaks. She had built the break into the foundation. She had left the pathway open. She had waited with the patience of someone who understands that the difference between preparation and luck is simply the willingness to keep working when nobody is watching. In the end, that is what the plaque meant. Not efficiency in the narrow sense of time saved or motion reduced. Efficiency in the deeper sense, the commitment to know the system well enough that when it breaks, you are already inside it. The refusal to let the noise of authority substitute for the discipline of understanding. The question is not what you can do when the room is watching. The question is what you have already done in every quiet hour before the alarm sounded. That is the work. That has always been the work.